this lesson, we're going to make a color wheel similar to this one. I actually printed this template up on acrylic paper and it just about destroyed my printer. So instead of that, we're going to use these stencils. These are from Stencil Girl. They're designed by Pam Carricker, who's another instructor on Jeanne Oliver. And I learned about these stencils through her class. And as someone who loves color and color wheels, and I just was all over these. So we're going to use one of these templates, but you don't have to. You could certainly use a ruler and a compass, but the stencil just makes it easier. I'm also creating this on, since we're using our oil paints today, I'm creating this on Arches oil paper. And this is what I use to paint my little landscapes. We'll do some landscapes on these later. But it's Arches oil paper, and I cut these 9x12 sheets into 2 5x7s and 1 4x6 each. And then I'll cut up a whole bunch so I have a stack ready. And then I end up with these little pieces that I use as scratch paper for testing out colors and that sort of thing. So I cut a piece of the Arches oil paper to a good size for the stencil, and I'm just going to use a mechanical pencil here, and these lines will get covered up by the paint. Now, I love making color wheels. I think they're so beautiful. I could sit around and just do that instead of actually doing a productive painting. But I think that there's so much value in them when it comes to learning about your colors, especially when you're working with a limited palette and you need to learn, like, what can these colors do? Doing color charts and color wheels can really give you a good sense of that. I found that these are also great to do when I'm feeling a little less than inspired. I start working on a color wheel or a color chart, and I start to get all these ideas of how I want to use the colors. It gets me playing with my paints in a way that's not intimidating. I don't feel nervous about how it's going to turn out. So it's a great way, especially if you're new to painting or new to watercolors, I think, or oils or whatever medium we're going to be working with. I think that playing with the paints is just such a great way to get past the, like, I'm afraid of drawing, I'm not good, because all you're doing is making a color wheel or a color chart. It just takes the pressure off. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this traced. For my other supplies, I'm going to use the size 1 Rosemary Ivory Flat, and this is so I can get into these tight little corners and get some nice straight lines. I'm also using I don't even know what size palette knife this is because it's not marked, but just a good, what this is, maybe about a 2-inch palette knife or so. It does not have to be specific. This is just to help you mix the colors cleanly. And then some paper towels to wipe off the palette knife and the brush, a plastic bag to put your dirty paper towels in, and then the colors that we're using are Ultramarine Blue Green Shade by Winsor & Newton, Burnt Sienna by Winsor & Newton, Yellow Ochre Pale, also Winsor & Newton, Cadmium Yellow Medium by Gamblin, and Titanium White by Winsor & Newton. And these are all in their professional lines. The nice thing about working with a limited palette is instead of buying all these colors, you just buy 5. And then you can buy much nicer, higher quality paints since you're not buying as many of them, and you're going to get a much better result. Okay, I had to figure out what I was gonna do here for a minute, but we're going to make a color wheel like this one. So we're going to focus on using a triad of colors. Even though we have 4 colors, we're just going to focus on mixing 3 of them. And because having 2 yellows I don't know, you can definitely work that in, but in this case, we're just gonna focus on 3. So we're gonna do ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and then burnt sienna is like our orange, and then the yellow ochre I'm going to use for the yellow. You could use cadmium yellow if you want to get some brighter greens through there. Actually, you know what? Since I have this as yellow ochre, and you can see this example, I'll go ahead and use cadmium yellow for mine. So we're going to start with the blue, and we're going to use the unmixed version of it. So it's just straight out of the tube, ultramarine blue, and we're going to use that in the middle. And again, we can go outside of these lines. I'm gonna make it kind of a gradient color wheel like this one, where there's defined sections, but then they all kind of blur together. And right now we're just going to focus on ultramarine blue, and we're going to work on this row. So we're gonna add just a bit of white to bring out the color. We're going to do the next square. Now for me, like, I actually don't love the color ultramarine blue all on its own. Like, it's just so bright, but I love it mixed. I feel that way about most blues. That's actually how I got into making a paint line, is I was mixing most of my own colors, and so I came out with a paint line to have my own colors. Okay, and then we want to, so the idea is that by the time we get to this outer ring, this is going to be almost white. It's just going to be a bluish white. So we've got to make sure, as we're working through these steps, and with only 4 steps, we're going to get there very quickly. We've got to make sure we're adding enough white to get there, but not quite too much. And you can kind of tinker with that a little bit. But as we work around the ring, we want to try to, this is not only an exercise on color, but it's an exercise on value. We want to try to have the values around each ring to be about the same. So if you look at it in black and white, it is like white, light gray, medium gray, almost black. So we had to mix quite a bit of white to get that there. And I'm gonna wipe my brush off. And for this, I'm really just gonna take mostly white and just a teeny bit of the blue. So we have just a very, very pale, almost white. Now, once you're getting here, this actually would be a really beautiful sky color as you add more white to it. Okay. So then we're gonna focus on the other pure colors. So let's do burnt sienna. And I'm kind of lazy about washing my brushes. I don't like wash it completely between uses. I just wipe it off on a paper towel. I want to use solvents, or I use Gamsol mineral spirits. I want to use that as less as I need to, as less as I can get away with. The reason why I love Burnt Sienna by Winsor Newton is that It's a very orange burnt sienna. There are some others that I've tried that are really beautiful for other applications. Like I really like Charvin Arts. Their burnt sienna is very kind of more pinkish red. But what happens when I mix it with blue is it ends up being very purple, and that's not what I want. I want my blues to be very blue and leaning more blue-green. So you might find this ultramarine blue-green shade is too, it's just too cool for you, too green, and you want to use a warmer blue. And a lot of ultramarine blues lean more purple. Or you might want to use a burnt sienna that's a bit more reddish. So you have to really try out different brands. And this is also why it's important to do color wheels and color charts when you get new paints, because all of them, every brand is a little bit different. You would think they're called the same, they would be the same, but they're not. And same thing with this one. At the very outer ring, we want it to be mostly white with just a hint of the color. Okay, now we're going to move on to cadmium yellow. In this exercise, you're going to use white the most. I remember the first time I was making color charts being like, oh, I feel like I'm wasting so much paint. But yeah, man, it's just such a good exercise. It's definitely not a waste to take the time to get to know your colors. One thing I use cadmium yellow a lot is for my brightest highlight. I'll mix it with white and use it as my brightest highlight in like clouds or something that's reflective. It just reads as kind of warm and bright and sunny, more than just titanium white alone. And if you find like it's not quite light enough, you can actually mix the white into the color right there on the color chart. Okay, now we're gonna start mixing. So we're gonna start with the rows that are in the middle of the two colors. So this row is going to be an even mix of ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow. So let's do that one first. I've got a little pile of cadmium yellow here. Let me grab about an even amount. if it's not perfect, like don't fret about it. And you really don't need a ton of this pure color because we're going to be adding white to the next few rows. This is my favorite. I get asked a lot about my greens for landscapes, and this is my favorite green mixture. And we'll explore this a little bit further because this on its own, it's a good grassy green, but it might be, in most cases, it's just a little bit too bright. So I mix in what's opposite from it, burnt sienna, to tone it down a little bit more. And I like adding white to my greens, and we'll talk about that more in when we're exploring some colors in a little less structured way as a color wheel. When we start exploring some colors more, I love Impressionist painters and their style, their loose style, and I love the palettes of like Monet and Sisley and I don't know, a few others. They escape me right now. But I love those kind of washed out palettes. I'm not a super colorful painter. And so when you're reading books on landscape, where I'm going with this little story is when you're reading books on landscape, a lot of them talk about how whites really wash out greens. And so they kind of avoid using white in greens in the landscape, and as much as possible. I mean, they do use it, but as much as possible, they avoid it. And I don't. I go for the white. I put the white in because I just want it all to be a little bit more washed out and muted. That's just my preference. I love these soft minty greens. All right, and then we'll work on this side here. So we're going to do an equal mix of burnt sienna and cadmium yellow. And what you're gonna find over here, this is gonna be a pretty bright orange. But we're gonna find a lot more colors over here that are gonna be nice for portraits. You already see that burnt sienna, just even on its own mixed with white, can be some really beautiful colors for portraits, for lips and cheeks, and for some, like a Caucasian skin, very pinkish skin, similar to mine. But you can also find some really beautiful tones, and we'll kind of go in this direction. Some really beautiful tones in here mixed with ultramarine blue. And then also going along in this direction, if you're using yellow ochre, you can find just so many beautiful pinks and oranges and all different kinds of skin tones in there. Where were we? Oh, yes. So with this one, using cadmium yellow, we come up with a brighter orange. And you could even do this, do one color wheel with yellow ochre pale to see how you get kind of these more muted tones. Obviously this is gonna be the same, but these you're gonna end up with more muted tones. And with this one, how we end up with brighter tones by using a brighter yellow. This is also a fun way to test out if you're going to want to use, like, add a new color to your palette. You can see, you know, put a color wheel together, plug it in, plug the new color in with colors that you already use. So maybe you want to add a red. So you're going to add cadmium red or alizarin, crimson, something like that. And so instead of doing burnt sienna, you plug the red in here and just see, you know, how that changes these colors and these ones, and see, is that one you want to add? Does it still speak to your palette or not. Can kind of help you make decisions about that. Because I'll tell you, I know, I get this, like, you just want to buy all the colors because they're just so pretty, especially if you love color. And what I've found is I have a ton of tubes of paint that are not cheap, that I don't ever use. I go to these same piles over and over and over again. Okay, and then we're gonna do the same for burnt sienna. Let's see if I can grab that. Not quite enough there. And these are my two favorite colors. If I had to live with only two colors, it would be ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. Maybe we need a touch more burnt sienna in that mix. But with those, you can mix grays and browns and blues. I would miss green, which is, oh, wrong end. Okay, that's no problem. We'll fix that. All right, so you get, this is where I get my black, is by mixing ultramarine blue. Try to scrape some of that off. Okay, I mix ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and that's how I get my black. And then we just start adding a little bit of white to it, and you're gonna see just what a wonderful gray it is. Just such a good, you can get all kinds of very neutral grays, warm, cold gray or cool grays, brownish gray, bluish gray. Such a good color combination. And as I said, within even the world of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, there could just be, with all the different brands and different shades, there you could just camp out there for a long time trying to figure out which combination you like the best. And I've done quite a few studies with ultramarine blue to try to find which ultramarine blue is my favorite. And the Winsor Newton ultramarine blue green shade is the one that's my favorite. The Utrecht ultramarine blue is the closest that I've found to the green shade, because unfortunately the ultramarine blue green shade in Winsor Newton only comes in really small tubes. Okay, so I kind of messed this one up here, so we're definitely going to have to add just some pure white to it to get it light enough. Just kind of mix it there on the spot. So that just goes to show you, you can't, especially with oils, they're super forgiving. You're not going to mess this up even if you start putting something in the wrong place. See that wonderful gray, just such a good gray. All right, so let's see where we want, really where you want to go from here. You can kind of go anywhere. I'm going to look at what piles I have mixed. So I've got this orangey color. That's the mix of both. And I feel like I still have enough of that to work with. So I'm going to take that and add in a little bit more burnt sienna. And that's going to be this one right in between. Now, I rarely use red in my paintings, so that's why I don't have red on the palette. But I use burnt sienna as both my orange and my red. Okay, what I'm seeing here is that I need to add a little bit more color. I feel like that went a little too light. I think this exercise can really help you appreciate the subtle shifts of color also. Like, even though I've done this exercise a lot, I'm always just amazed at how just a tiny shift of color, just a little addition, can make such a difference. I feel like that needs to be just a little lighter. Just gonna mix in a little white. Okay, then let's tackle this one. So we're doing mostly cadmium yellow with just a little bit of burnt sienna. And we want to make sure that it looks more yellow than this color here. So there's a distinction between the two. Go. So one reason why I leave all the piles there that I've worked on is if I want to go back and tweak anything. And I feel like maybe this blue is a little dark. Oops, I'm mixing a little gray into that one. Let me try not to do that. Okay. So what you're looking for is that the values of the interior ring, this middle ring here are all about the same. If they're not perfect, that's okay, but that's kind of how you can judge your color wheel. adding a bit more white to this one. You can kind of see it better if you, well, you can see it much better if you take a picture with your phone and then turn it to black and white. Then you can really tell which ones are too dark or too light. You can also kind of squint at it, and that can give you a good idea. Definitely working in black and white is easier, kind of reveals a little bit more. I'll lighten this one up just a touch. Okay, I'm happy with that. And again, here's the comparison. So you can see now this has more of a, I don't know what I'm trying to say. There are more colors. So there's a more gradual transition from one color to the next than this color wheel. But you get the same result, just a little bit of a more limited color palette. But you can see in here, you know, start to kind of hunt for colors. Like, okay, I really like these for a landscape. I really like this kind of range here for my sky, or this for my sky. Or I love these colors. These would be great to do a portrait study with. Which we'll do, but start studying the colors and seeing kind of what you're drawn to. This can also give you a good sense of what other colors you might want to try to add to your palette if you're kind of drawn to the more warm side of the palette or the cool side of the palette. This is definitely my happy place right here. I love these cool colors and greens and blues, and of course I love the neutrals. All right, one more thing I want to show too. If you don't have a project that you're going to work on right away, if you're going to go right into painting, then you might want to work from these piles to start a painting. That could be a fun way to do a little color study, like a color study landscape. For these like scratch pieces of paper, this is kind of a fun way to see, like, okay, where could these go? So let's try, this is the sky here, maybe going more into these sort of gray blues. Just kind of dance around from what you have. Let's see, let's try a little bit of a gray for clouds. Maybe some of this gray, mixed in, a little yellow. So I'm just playing. I don't have any any agenda in mind. I am kind of putting the sky where the sky goes. But other than that, it's just wherever I want to put things. Let's try this darker blue, see what that does. I really love sort of a more green blue as a sky. And it's okay, like if you're making a mess, that's all right. This is just, how can we use these colors on the palette? Where would we put them? I think these blues could be distant hills. They'd probably be a little bright. I would use the black like for my trees that are in shadow. All of these greens are going to be fairly bright because they're not toned down. So while this color palette would be brighter than I would do, it's just kind of giving me a sense of how I could use these colors. Maybe we want to put some So there we go, just like a little landscape study from the colors we have. We could do another one. It's just kind of a fun way to use up your paints and play with these piles. Now this is more, I tend to do a lot of gray skies. This is more my speed here. The other one felt a little bright for me. And I do love putting a little bit of color in my cloud, like getting the burnt sienna in there, a little yellow, maybe. Just keeps things from getting too boring. Then we can use this bright white with the cadmium yellow. Now I would definitely mix that with burnt sienna, so let's go ahead and do that so it's not quite so intense. There we go, a couple of little quick studies. So definitely use the paint you have on your palette and some scratch paper just as a chance to play. And then what I do with the rest of the paint on the palette, this is what I do with oils. I pull it all together into a pile, and I usually get some kind of a blue, green, gray color just because I usually have a lot of blues and yellows on my palette, and greens. This one's gonna come out a little different than I think my usual. This is close to kind of my usual mix that I get from leftovers on the palette. This one's got a lot more burnt sienna and yellow in it. So it's just kind of a really nice little putty color. So then the next time I'm painting, I can use this as sort of a pre-mixed warm gray. I just put that there, and then I finish cleaning off my palette. And I do that every time I finish painting, and I kind of clean up my piles because I'll pull from those and they'll get a little messy. I'm not always fastidious about not mixing or polluting my paints. Then I'll just wipe this down with a paper towel. And if it's being stubborn, I'll use a little bit of Gamsol and clean it off. And that's what this is how I clean both my wood palette and my glass palette, is the same way. The wood one though, I'll definitely use some Gamsol because it doesn't wipe up quite this easily. And then I'll use just a little bit of linseed oil to keep it hydrated. But with the glass, you can just wipe it down. And then I'm ready to go to paint the next time.